Thank you, Richard. When Matthew here asked me to come and speak to you a few months ago, he gave me a range of dates, and I must admit I was very wary about the idea of coming to Edinburgh too soon in the year. I thought, well, Edinburgh in March, maybe not. April, no. Beginning of May even, no. 30th of May, it'll be summer. So, well, it wasn't too bad today, actually, given that it was pouring down with rain where I live when I left home. We had a very pleasant day in the sort of sunshine, the sort of interrupted sunshine of Edinburgh. So anyway, the title of my talk, as you would have heard, is The Organic Radical Tradition. And I suspect that you might have had two questions to ask about that title. The first being, what on earth is organic radicalism? Which is one question that I'm hopefully going to answer. And the second one being, in what way could organic radicalism be described as a tradition? Because I have to admit that I made the term up myself about 6 years ago, or at least in the political sense. There is something called organic radicals in chemistry, I understand. I have no idea what that means because I haven't got that sort of knowledge. But I made it up to describe something which hasn't really got a name, which is why I had to make something up. And so what it is a way of thinking that is not visible to us in today's society, and that has been made invisible, I would say. It's a sort of philosophy of the world that is counter to the prevailing scientific, centralised corporate worldview, and that therefore is not recognised by that corporate world. And any little part of it that bubbles up from time to time is quickly pushed back down again and described as being all reactionary or disinformation or dangerous or far right or extreme left or anti-Semitic or whatever the insult of the day is. But although the label I made up, so it's not a traditional label, the actual content of this philosophy is very traditional. Because in my mind, it's the sort of lost human wisdom. It's the shared human wisdom that we've had for hundreds and thousands of years that should have been fueling our current way of seeing things. But thanks to interference from various authorities and controlling forces that want us to think in such a way as we go along with their vile system, this alternative understanding and knowledge has been lost to sight. In fact, I see it as being in a sort of another dimension, that there's everything that we think now, all the political opinions we think we can have, there's a sort of range of things we can have from far left to far right, and and all these categories that you can place yourself in politically and philosophically. But all that is just a screen to hide us from this ancient wisdom, this alternative wisdom. And I think in order to get through to the other side of this screen, you have to have seen through the deceit and the lies. So anyway, it's a philosophy that fits in very well with what people have been undergoing over the last few years, especially since COVID. There's been this process that a lot of people have had of seeing suddenly that everything they thought was true isn't true, and that all of that was just propaganda and a spectacle. And of passing through this barrier into another place where suddenly everything looks completely different. And you can pass through this invisible barrier of deceit from a number of different directions, for a number of different starting points. So, if you're an environmentalist, for example, and your belief is that you love nature, you hate to see nature being destroyed, you hate to see the effects of development and industry and pollution, chemicals, and everything that's happening, phone masks going up everywhere. You just want things to be how they should be in the natural world. And so you've always given yourself the label of environmentalist, or maybe you've joined some environmental organisation or other. And suddenly you realise, hang on, they're not actually standing up for nature anymore. They're not actually talking about nature anymore. They're just talking about technology and renewable energy and wind farms and solar panels and climate They're not even talking about pollution of air pollution or river pollution or the pollution of the sea with plastics or anything. No, they're only talking about the climate and the fact that this is an emergency which is going to necessitate huge amounts of government money across the world being pushed into certain private pockets that turn out to be the same private pockets that are funding the so-called environmentalist movement. You know, if you realise all this as an environmentalist, you then step through this invisible barrier and you find yourself saying, oh, you know, I've still got my beliefs, my original beliefs of being an environmentalist in the real sense, but now I see all this had been constructed to push my environmentalism into certain other purposes. The same would be true if you started off from a general left-wing position. You know, you believe in fairness, that people, rich people shouldn't own everything, that ordinary people should have as much rights, and that, you know, everything shouldn't be run for private profit. And then you realise that a lot of the left isn't talking about that anymore. They're just obsessed with, identity politics, with transgenders, and all the woke talking points. And if you then start to wonder what lies behind this and why the left has turned from being something in opposition to the system into being something which seems to be at the forefront of pushing its agenda, which we saw in COVID, that the left-wing activists, including anarchists, in fact, were actually going out and countering freedom protests and, having banners calling for people to be vaccinated. And why are they doing, they've just been turned into the sort of political enforcement wing of the big pharma. So if you're a leftist and you suddenly realise all this, again, you're going to step through this barrier and you're going to suddenly say, oh, things look very different from here. All that was false. All those political parties have been captured. All those movements, I was just being used. My ideals are being used to push somebody else's agenda. And if then you look over and you see the environmentalist who's come through the same process, and you start talking to each other, you start to say, oh, hang on, there's something a bit bigger happening here. And it's not just the left and Greens. It's you could say the same from a conservative, a sort of traditional conservative point of view. If you're a small c conservative, let's say, who wants to see a society that is coherent and stable and based on values and the rest of it. So you say, I'm a conservative. I vote for the right because that's they want to keep things as they are, and they family values and proper education, and I'm against all this woke stuff that the left believes in. So, and if you then look at what they're actually doing and saying, these right-wing parties, and you realise, well, of course they're actually pushing a move away from anything that could be described as traditional society or cohesive cultures or communities. They're promoting the aggressive acceleration of commercial society and the dehumanization, gentrification, the rule of money over people. So if you really hold those small c conservative values to your heart, then you're not going to lend your support to these people. And again, you're going to step through this barrier to the other side. And to your utter astonishment, you're going to find yourself standing next to a leftist and a tree hugger who are looking back at this same wall from the other side and saying, "Blimey, they were trying to fool us." But luckily, we're not going to fall for that. We found we've got things in common, because actually somebody, an environmentalist wants a cohesive traditional society as much as a so-called conservative does. And the same sort of process could happen with religion as well. If you're somebody who really believes in good against evil, and you've got a spiritual conviction to do all you can in your life in order to support that idea, and then you see the way your organised religion, whatever it happens to be, behaves. When you think about what the Church of England was like, or the Vatican was like over COVID, they were indistinguishable from all the states of the world and from the big pharma's position. If you have that realization, you again are going to step through to the other side of this thing and say, well, I'm still got my same core values. It's not about changing your values. It's realizing that your values have been misused and you've been manipulated by people claiming to share those core values into, in fact, supporting the opposite of your core values. It could also come from no position at all. I mean, a lot of people don't actually have a political position. I mean, I've always had one, so I sort of tend to imagine that everyone does. But since COVID, again, I've met a lot of people who said, "Oh, I wasn't interested in politics." Perhaps they're the sort of people who instinctively see through those sort of lies and deceit in the first place. They not have anything to do with them. They're obviously a bunch of liars and charlatans who are just after power. I'm not going into that. And they just like to be left alone. I think a lot of people just get left alone to get on with their own life without having to worry about that. Again, COVID comes along, and a lot of people realise they weren't going to leave you alone. They won't even let you go to see your own dying relatives, or meet with your friends, or go out of your house without permission and all. So there came a point for people there that they had to say, no, I can't maintain this position of thinking that I'm in a vaguely benign state or a society, and that if they will leave me alone if I don't get into any trouble, if I don't say anything, don't rock the boat. So then they're forced into this other side of seeing all the deceit that there's been controlling their lives, and they also find themselves next to very political people, and there's a lot of learning to be done there, a big learning curve to find out what these people have learned in their lives, why they find themselves there. And the last category really that is of anarchists. Well, I still do. I call myself an anarchist still, and I used to be involved in the anarchist movement. And in theory, anarchists should already be at least halfway into the other side of this barrier. In reality, I'd have said, the anarchist movement as a whole, worldwide, has got like a half a foot through this barrier, and the rest of it has stayed stuck, unfortunately, in the spectacle of false ideas. Primary amongst them, I would say, is the industrial progress ideal. I mean, anarchists, unfortunately, even back in the 19th century, were talking about scientific anarchism and how we were going to be liberated by electricity, or things that seem to me patently untrue. We've been progressively progressively captured and enslaved by all this technology, which is now becoming more apparent as we come in towards the era of smart cities and digital currency and so on. But still, there are a few anarchists who have come through to the other side of this and can communicate the core anarchist values to people who have also seen through this spectacle and are beginning to trying to look for some sort of references to understand how to see the world, which is where I come in, I suppose. That's what I'm trying to do, is take what I've learned from anarchism and communicate it to people who've seen through these lies and deceit, without necessarily trying to convert them to anarchism in the political sense, but just trying to help build I think we've got to start again. We've got to start building again a new way of seeing the world based on something that isn't lies and isn't manipulation. So the Organic Radical website, which is the way in which organic radicalism exists, I suppose, because there are one or two other people who've started using the term since I started doing it, which is gratifying. But it consists mainly, there are a few essays talking about various themes, and it consists mainly of profiles of around 90, just over 90 different thinkers. And they come from very different backgrounds. The idea, this is obviously, as you'd have gathered, the idea is to bring together all these threads and to show what they have in common. So there's a lot of interconnections between the different thinkers. I've tried to put links in to the others in the site where they mentioned each other's work or where they had similar ideas, so that people can see that it's an overall web of ideas which does in fact amount to one single idea, a very large and complex and multifaceted idea, but it is a single tradition. That's what I would say. It's a holistic tradition because it is based on the idea of seeing things holistically, but also the way it's presented on the site is holistic. I think it's sort of doubly holistic, and it is holistic in content and in form. So So who are these people, the thinkers that I mentioned on the site? In order to explain that a little bit, I'm going to have to break them back down into different categories, which seems counterproductive after what I just said, because the idea is to unite them. But if I don't adopt some sort of linear approach, it's going to be a very confusing talk that will just go around in spirals and circles and cross back on itself. So I'll just pick out a few of the areas and a few of the speakers to explain what I mean. The first group, well, I'll start with the first group being anarchists, because obviously I've drawn on some of my favourite anarchist thinkers in this project. I don't know whether all of you know very much about what anarchism really is. I know that a lot of people think that anarchism is chaos, and it's something we descend into when things aren't going well, and when law and order is broken down, and society is crumbling. We're descending into anarchy. It's sheer anarchy. But that's the pejorative view, obviously. The real idea of anarchism, and the anarchist view of anarchy, is that it's a state of order. It's a condition of order, but of natural order. That, like all other animals on the planet, we naturally have an innate capacity to organise ourselves and live amongst ourselves, to feed ourselves and shelter us, to work with other people, because we're not just isolated individual animals. There are very few that are, and that we do that best if left alone. If there isn't some higher so-called authority, some lord or some government or some tax-imposing institution that comes along and tells us what to do and makes us and extracts what we create from us and pushes us around. And tells us what we can think and what we can teach our children and so on. So it's in itself, in my opinion, anarchy is an organic idea, because it's an idea of a natural society. One of the anarchists I talk about, who's profiled, is Peter Kropotkin, who is a famous Russian anarchist who died just over 100 years ago. His great idea was mutual aid, which he developed as an argument against the political Darwinism that was very prevalent at the end of the 19th century. Not necessarily the ideas of Darwin himself, who was a scientist, of course, but of the people who took his ideas and turned it into a political idea, that humans come about through evolution, and that's all about the survival of the fittest and the strongest. So it's a dog-eat-dog world where those who dominate others are going to go on to have offspring, and so the next generation will be even more dominant and powerful and selfish. So, which is a sort of basis of neoliberalism or Thatcherism and things like that, isn't it? Just the ones that succeed do so because they're the ones that were meant to succeed. They're the best people are the ones that trample over everyone else and get to the top. And he took the exact opposite view, needless to say, and said that, yes, of course there obviously is competition in animal and human societies, but we wouldn't still be around as a species if we hadn't also very much focused on cooperation and working together and solidarity. In fact, and he says he traces that right back to animals and says it's the same with throughout all of the animal and human history. Cooperation has been the dominant tendency, not the only one, but the dominant one. And he wrote a book called Mutual Aid, and another one called Ethics, where he sourced our ethics, human ethics, into our natural belonging. That our ethics are all about mutual aid, about helping people. That our ethics is if you see a child drowning in the river, you go and help them. You don't say it's not my child. It's not got my DNA in it, so I'm going to let it die. That's not the way people are. Which is. So he was an important anarchist writer and important for the organic radical idea because of this or because of that aspect. Another one I mention is Gustav Landauer, who was a German Jewish anarchist who died again about the same time as Kropotkin. But he was interesting because he took a spiritual dimension to his anarchism, which is one of the criticisms I would have against anarchism generally. Anarchists generally is that they sort of in denial of anything, like, you know, no gods, no masters is the phrase. But you know, whenever I've mentioned anything spiritual in some anarchist milieu, you know, the people are, what, you know, they just get very, very angry about the idea of spirituality. For some reason, I don't know, it's probably something to do with their early life or something, or they were dominated by a priest when they were a child or something, I don't know. But Landauer included spirituality in his idea of anarchism, because he talked about the spirit, the Geist of a community. He's German, so he said Geist, but what he meant was spirit. That there is a collective spirit to any group of people, and he said to the whole of the human species that there are, in fact, levels of sort of souls, sort of collective souls within humanity, and we're not just individuals, which again is going against the sort of prevalent contemporary Thatcherite idea that, you know, we're all just competing individuals. We're just, you know, there's no belonging. There's no real belonging to us. The state has to provide the belonging, and the flag, and the uniforms. You know, if you left to our own devices, we don't have that. And he talked about, for example, when a revolution came, he was hoping for a revolution in the sense of an overturning of the established order of the time. But rather than taking this the normal left-wing view of having to organise people and build a revolution by having parties and, you know, and sort of just having the revolutionaries ready to take over the revolution, you know, the avant-garde of the revolution, who end up being the dictators usually, you know. He saw it as being something spontaneous. Because of this Geist, that could be possible, that there would be a spontaneous coming together of people, the sort of vibes going around, I suppose you'd say, in contemporary language, just the energy, the collective energy that would that could lead people to come together and take on the existing system. And I've seen that a few times. I mean, unfortunately, I've not seen it come to its fruition. I've not seen anybody actually overturn the government, obviously. But you know, sometimes you're in some mood, like the protests against the Iraq War. I wrote a bit about this recently. So I went back and thought about the moments I'd had, protests against the Iraq War and against the Gilets jaunes, because I was in France for the Gilets jaunes uprising a few years ago, the yellow vests, I think they were, or the yellow jackets, what they were called here, which was very, very impressive, because it was just people who weren't political. It wasn't a political thing. These were just people who had enough of a lot of it was working people who'd had enough of working and still not having enough money to do anything or pay their bills at the end of the month, and they just sick to death of it all. And by some sort, I mean, it was by the internet. Yes, okay, it was on Facebook or whatever. But there was also a human element, that there was just this energy that people, when they were coming together, they were going on the roundabouts. That's what they went and sat on the roundabouts for weeks on end, and then other people joined them, and they ended up saying a lot. I've watched a lot. I spoke to a lot of them. I went out and reported on them actually, and interviewed a lot of them, and now I've watched a lot of material about them. And the common thing to a lot of these roundabouts and local groups was that people were saying, well, we found a belonging again. I used to spend all my life sitting in front of the television, and you know, I was just depressed and didn't know anyone, and now I've got friends and we're all together and we've still got the same ideas and we've got these plans. And there was a group near us that were getting really advanced actually at one point. This was just before COVID. They were getting really advanced. They got committees to do, a committee on self-sufficiency in food, and a committee on building our own educational networks for the children, and another one on looking after old people or whatever. And they were actually really seriously planning to take over running their own community. So that shows the potential to me. Like they used to talk about the Dunkirk spirit, when there's a moment of crisis, something comes up against it. And I think we did see that a bit in COVID as well, with your movement here, this group here that has emerged, and ones like it all over the place, and all the big protests that we had. It's again, I think this is this same energy, this same collective energy that Landauer was talking about. So, yeah, there's a few other anarchists in the organic radical profiles. I won't go into all of them because I want to move on to other things. Another contrasting thread is of traditionalists, by which I mean, another word that's used to describe them is perennialists, who believe in the perennial philosophy, which they see as being an underlying age-old wisdom. It's that thing I was talking about just now, actually, this idea of an underlying universal human wisdom. The site has got profiles of Chuang Tzu, who was a Taoist philosopher from 3rd century, I think it was BC, and Plotinus, who was one of the later Greek philosophers who was a follower of Plato. But there's a whole group of people who were trying to revive those ideas or put them into a different form at the start of the 20th century, such as René Guénon, who was a Frenchman who converted to Sufism and went to live in Egypt. He wrote a number of brilliant books. He's a brilliant man. And one of them was called, what was it called? The Crisis of the Modern World. So as well as reclaiming the sort of unity of the core ideas behind all of the world's religions, when you strip away all the sort of particularities and all the little rituals and things, the actual idea behind them behind all of them is a oneness, that there is a one universe, and that we're all expressions and manifestations of that oneness. I think it would be a very short summary. But as well as having this philosophical, metaphysical idea, he also had a critique of industrial society as he saw it at the start of the 20th century, and pointing out that it was the reign of quantity, as he called it, rather than of quality, and that the world was racing downhill at modern society was like a boulder rolling down a mountainside, going faster and faster and faster, and it wasn't going to stop until it reached the bottom. This critique of the modern world is very much part of what this organic radicalism idea, which was shared by other members of this traditionalist school. Ananda Kumaraswamy was another one. Well, I won't go into too many names because that'll just get overwhelming. But there's another interrelated thread of people it's another thread that is sort of not really known about. And I think it's deliberately not known about because they don't want you to know that people were saying these things. There's a thread of anti-industrialist thinkers. And even now, when I say I'm against industrialism, there are people who say, "Well, how can you be against industrialism? That's just insane. We can't go back in time. You can't. We don't want to go back to the Stone Age. You can't turn the clocks back and the rest of it." But I think we've been taught to think that the arrival of industrial society was a natural phenomenon, that it was somehow bound up with the very passing of time itself, that it was inevitable since the beginning of everything, that by the time the year 2000 came, we would be all, driving cars and watching televisions and having mobile phones and things, as if it was, and also as if it was some sort of advance, as if it was some sort of positive thing that's happened to us. Whereas I don't see it like that at all. And there's quite a tradition of people who think the same way, who you don't hear about. I expect you've heard of William Morris, for example, who was the English socialist back in the 19th century, who did beautiful works of art, tapestries and so on, was part of the pre-Raphaelite movement. But he was absolutely opposed to industrialism. He said there's one thing he dominated his life more than on an equal par, I think he said, to his love of beautiful things was his hatred of the modern world. And John Ruskin as well, who was one of his somebody who inspired him, said a similar thing. He said, "I seem to be all alone in my opposition to the modern world." He challenged railways. Why do we need railways? They've just built a new railway somewhere in the north of England, from somewhere to Bakewell, I think it was. which now enables people to get from this Bakewell to this other town in half an hour, and to get back, and other people to get in the other direction in half an hour. And he didn't understand what good this was, that people would be able to get from one village to the other even faster than they were before. And yet they'd ruined this beautiful valley in the Peak District or wherever it was by laying the railway. And I think, railways were the first part of the. To me, they were the first part of what we got now. When we look at what we're entering into now, this prospect of smart cities and digital surveillance, and I've seen you've got these cropping up in Edinburgh already, these low emission zones and things, which is quite alarming, and a lot of these masts everywhere. That it just sort of feels like the walls are closing in, doesn't it? But I see that as starting. The process is starting with the railways, and of course, the reason the railways were built was to make money. I mean, it was not just out of selling tickets to people, but it was part of creating this industrial infrastructure to extract wealth from nature and bring it into the industrial centres, and then to use that and to sell it, or export it overseas. And it was the beginning of the globalisation process that has got us here. It was, along with the British Empire, which was also was stage one of globalisation. Whatever. We now think of it as, I don't know what people think of it as. Some people really don't like it for various reasons. And some people think it was something to be proud of, that Britain was doing this because it meant we were important. But in fact, it wasn't really Britain doing it. It was the City of London. It was the financiers that were making money out of the British Empire. The same people who made money out of the American Empire, and the same people who are going to be making money out of Chinese world domination. So it was the railways were the start of. And early industrialism were just the start of something. They were the start of something which we can see continuing. And some people in the 19th century were sharp enough to see already that was happening. Thoreau was another one in America who saw the same thing and warned against it. More recently, there's been anti-industrial. Jacques Ellul was a French writer and thinker, who is very influential in France. I think he's a little bit known in this country. I don't know if anyone here knows Jacques Ellul. Yep, somebody does, good. Who warned about, he called it technique, and that it has sort of got a life of its own, this process. It's a sort of eating away at the humanity and a sort of pushing down of humanity in favour of a money-making structure. And there's still some going out of France. There's quite a lot of there's a school of anti-industrialist thinking still today, which there isn't here, I don't think, in Great Britain. But there are, and there's a Spanish writer called Miguel Amoros, who is an anarchist who's a very anti-industrialist. Yeah, in France there's a whole sort of milieu of people critiquing it, and so that forms another important part of this organic radical idea. There's also a there's a group of Indian thinkers actually that are featured, which I think is interesting, because it led me sort of researching. It led me to read a bit about these Indians, who actually share this anti-industrial critique and an anti-imperial technique as well, critique as well, because they're very well placed to see in India that industrialism and empire were the same thing, because the British came in and started building railways everywhere and chopping down their forests and extracting all their wealth and making them work for British money and so on. And one of the main anti-industrialists in India, of course, was Gandhi, who's now mainly known for being a sort of pacifist, and he's claimed by a sort of certain sort of left-wing non-violence movement as being their guru. But in fact, the main point of what he was saying was that India should not follow the Western path, and that they should go back to a village-based community. I expect you've seen pictures of him weaving and things like that, and living a sort of low-tech lifestyle. And here there was a whole movement that was associated with him. There were the Kumarappa brothers, who I'm sure nobody's ever heard of now, but they talked about villagism, and they gave the choice of they did these pamphlets, socialism or capitalism or villagism. So it was something completely different outside of the left-right thing. And I think that could appeal to people now. Actually, you hear a lot of people talking about this decentralisation and going back to ways we used to live that are healthier and happier and certainly freer than what we've got now. So, and there's one other, Kumaraswamy that I mentioned earlier was Indian, well, Sri Lankan more. But so that there's another interconnection there with that spiritual path. And Sri Aurobindo as well, I mentioned, who was a great spiritual warrior from India. There's also some Jewish thinkers in there, which is worth noting for, I'm sure they're not here tonight, but for those people who accuse me of being anti-Semitic because I dare to criticise the Rothschilds, amongst others. But actually, there's some very inspiring Jewish writers, of course, but particularly there's a school which is described by one Jewish writer, Michael Louis, who's a sort of Brazilian French, I think. He calls them the anti-capitalist romantics. One of whom was Gustav Landauer, the anarchist that I mentioned at the beginning of this section. But there was a whole school of them. This was before the First World War, and of Jewish thinkers, mainly German in Central Europe, who were inspired by sort of traditional romantic German ideas of going back to nature and being against industrialism and reviving the spirit of the folk and so on, but not in the way. Obviously, they were Jewish. It wasn't the Nazi thing of the folk and the Führer and the rest of it. It was the idea of community, and they were very strong critics of the modern world. But they all disappeared. That whole movement was wiped out. Not just because of the First World War, but obviously because of the rise of the Nazis, when there was being Jewish and German at the same time was declared impossible, basically. First by the Nazis and then by the Zionists, and so the whole possibility of that school of thought was destroyed effectively. But their writing is still there. There's people like Walter Benjamin is very good, and Martin Buber, who called himself a Zionist, but it was nothing like the version we have today. It was a sort of anarchic, decentralized, sort of a communal way of seeing things. There are also a few scientists on the organic radical side, although I don't know very much about science. When they start expressing ideas on the basis of their science, I do understand them. And there's some quite interesting scientists who talked about holistic reality, who had theories and did experiments to show that larger groups of individuals form organisms, and that there are collective elements that direct humanity or direct animals in certain directions, and that we need to look at things from a distance and not focus just on the detail, which is also a sort of philosophical point against the modern way of thinking in general, the contemporary way of thinking. That I was talking to Richard about that the other day. That specialists, we've got a lot of specialists who are very, very specialised in some very narrow subject matter that they know everything about, and they hang around and go to conferences and so on with other people who know everything about. There's something very close to what they know about, but they've got no overall vision. They can't see the bigger picture. I mean, generally, anyone who in our society is seeing the bigger picture isn't favoured. I mean, you're supposed to. It used to be sort of obvious common sense that you not seeing the wood for the trees was stupid. Now, if you see the wood and not just individual trees, you're a conspiracy theorist, or you're exaggerating. It's woolly thinking. We want facts and science, and just everything broken down so that you can't make the connections, and you can't really see what's going on. So these scientists' points of view were very much confirm and enhance the philosophical points that are being made. elsewhere in these profiles. There are some just out and out nature writers. Well, I mentioned Thoreau, but I've got to mention Richard Jefferies, who's one of my favourite writers in the course of my life. He was sort of nature. He was around in Victorian times, and he was a sort of nature mystic. And he went up on the hills and had visions of the past and the future, and felt himself to be connected to the earth and to the trees and to the grass, and very inspiring stuff. But again, not the sort of thing that is favoured in our current world. That sort of talk. Why? I mean, a lot of people think like that. I talk to a lot of people who have those sort of ideas, and yet it's considered fringe or not very clever or ridiculous. And yet, that's what humans are. We're not robots. We're not scientists. We do have dreams and ideas and inspirations, and so that's all part of this overall idea I'm trying to get of what we've lost and what we need to get back. I'm trying to think if I've missed anything important. There's one or two old-fashioned socialists as well, very old-fashioned, going back to the Peasants' Revolt. John Ball, who was the hedgerow priest, I think they called him, he was this one that said he had that. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? I think that was it. So it was, and basic. But that sort of socialism to me is fundamental. It's not, but it's got nothing to do with the modern left and what they're saying. It's nothing to do with controlling people or building a state or dictating what they have to think. It's just about justice. It's a natural justice, obvious justice. And Gerald Winstanley as well. I wrote about. I've written quite a lot about him actually over the recent years. But he was one of the diggers. I don't know if people know the diggers. It was in the English Civil War, or there was one here as well, I think, in Scotland. But he was specifically in England, and the diggers had this. It was after Cromwell had seized power, after the so-called revolution had succeeded, and just after they'd executed the king, Charles. Not that I'm saying it was a good thing or anything, but they decided that they wanted things to go a lot further than that. They wanted a real revolution, because actually they'd realised that the Cromwell's revolution wasn't a real revolution. I mean, this was around the same time he was putting down the Levellers' revolt in the New Model Army, and when he finally put down the revolt at Burford, the big feast was laid on for him by the City of London and the bankers and the financiers. So anyway, the diggers had seen a few months before that, or a year or so, but they'd seen that things weren't really progressing, that nothing had changed, basically, that although supposedly the revolution had triumphed, that there were still lords and ladies and who owned the land, and ordinary people still hadn't got had been stolen from them hundreds of years ago. I mean, they dated it back to the Norman conquest. So they just went and seized some land and said it was common land, and they said, right, we're going to dig on the common land, and they wrote a lot of pamphlets with all their ideals in, which are great, and which unfortunately, of course, they were just crushed. Even though they were living in this supposedly post-revolutionary situation, but they made the fact that they made this attempt, a very small-scale attempt. There was only a few dozen of them on a hill in Surrey, and the fact that people are still talking about them, 480 years later, wherever it is, means that they did achieve something. And I think that sort of mythology is important as well for the way we see things. That we've got heroes of the past that we can look back to and say, yes, this is our lineage, this is our tradition. Which again is what they're trying to take away from us, is this idea of an underground tradition of resistance and popular uprising and they're just presenting as no, it's just a question of voting for Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak or something. So so I suppose I could. So overall, I may remember some other people to come back to, but I would say that overall, the importance of this organic radical idea is, as I said, it's in its altogether-ness, its connectedness, and the fact that it is one thing, and also the fact that this thing has been repressed, as I said, and the fact that the realizing that this tradition has been forced underground, has been made invisible, in fact forms part of the organic radical philosophy, I would say, because it is not just the accumulated wisdom of all these various thinkers. It's something that takes that into account and then takes a step back and says, well, why has that disappeared? And understands why. So it involves, in fact, what we would call a conspiracy theory view of history, if you're that way inclined, but it involves seeing the way that there is a system that has deliberately pushed and manipulated and buried and shaped the ways that people are able to think, in order that people can't contradict its assumptions, and that we can't form something powerful that would form the base, a philosophy that would form the basis of a proper opposition to what's going on, rather than these sort of half-baked fake oppositions that keep cropping up and lead us into dead ends, because they're not really based in anything solid and real. And the organic radical idea is also about, as you'd have gathered from what I just said, about changing something, which is why the word radical comes into it. So as well as knowing that this is a philosophy that has emerged in opposition to all of that I was saying, all this manipulation, it's also knowing a philosophy that knows that it is important in taking on the next stage. So I think it's sort of quite a sussed philosophy in my mind. It's something that's taken into account. It's a 21st century philosophy that has taken into account everything that's happened for the last few hundred years. Whereas if you look at sort of Marxism, for example, it was written in the 19th century. So it doesn't actually know as a philosophy what has happened since then. It hasn't taken it into account. And so where do we go from here with it? Well, it's got to happen organically, of course, as the name suggests, because you can't. I don't care if this philosophy is ever known, or if people call it organic radicalism, because I didn't invent it. Or as some explain, it's just something that is there. It's just something that has to be rediscovered. It has to be unearthed, revealed, exposed, explored, worked on. And maybe it's best if it doesn't have a name. I think really you could just call it common sense, or seeing things clearly, having your head screwed on. But it'd be nice if people could, if it would help people just to cut themselves free from the current categories and labels and this idea of thinking you have to, if you agree with somebody on one thing and you associate with them in one thing, you have to go along with everything else they say, because that's the party line, or I'm that, therefore I don't agree with you on this, and I get very angry if you say something that doesn't fit in with my worldview, and we can't have a discussion because that's one of my trigger points. You just say something that it's absolutely impossible for anyone in my group to ever talk to anyone like that, and which we see an awful lot of, don't we? So yeah, I suppose that's the overall aim, is to open things up, open up the discussion, which is what a real democratic society would look like. So.